Well, good evening, everybody. I wasn't expecting this many when I said I'd do this. Welcome to the Botolph Church to hear this amazing story, the story of the Shepshed Thunderbolt, and the work that's gone into unravelling the mystery of World War II local air crash. My name is Richard Rock, but I'm only the presenter of this fascinating story. The main man is Neil Entwistle, who is here tonight, and others, some of whom are also here tonight, and they'll be mentioned in the talk. I've been involved in this for a relatively short time, but in that short time I've come to realise what an important story this is. I've spent time talking with Neil about all the work he's completed that brings us to this point tonight. And I think I'm right in saying that when he started, he thought he was just going to research the details of a wartime air crash. But as you will see, as the story begins to unfold, it's so much more than that. Not only the details of the crash, but also the very human story that also unfolds. If you've got any questions, what I think we're going to try and do is, if I can ask you to keep them till the end, we'll have a chance to get a drink, look at the display that Neil's put together, and then we'll talk in an informal setting of taking those questions. Just one other thing before we start this evening. You did get in without paying. Well, as most buildings require maintenance, it's always important. Got there in the end, didn't it? Present, the church is facing bills to replace the roof, etc. So we're holding the joint event to tell the story and to raise money. So we need to raise about £50,000. So if you're able to help, your help would be much appreciated. We don't need it all tonight. I mean, just some of it. And if you don't carry cash, fear not. We have a contactless machine by the door with the fierce treasurer holding it. Okay. We've also got an online page, which is shepshedandoaks.co.uk/Thunderbolt, which will also have the live streamed recording of this event as well, and an opportunity to donate there. I think that's everything. So as I say, it's nice to have the joint thing together, so let's get on with the evening. Thank you very much. So, how did all of this start? Well, for Neil Entwistle, this all began back in 1998, right here at St Botolph's Church, when some fellow ringers happened to mention the wartime crash of an American fighter plane near Blackbrook Reservoir. Well, Neil was immediately hooked. He just wanted to find out more about what happened. The bell ringers also gave Neil directions to the field where the aircraft came down. So he went along there to have a look around and to see what he might find, any information he could find. But he really struggled to find any information about the incident locally. In fact, he could only find brief reference to it in a couple of local history publications. This one is the Shepshed Wartime Memories by Jean Perry, and Malcolm Dark's Blackbrook Dam Disaster Book. Both publications made reference to a Thunderbolt crashing near the reservoir and an American pilot being killed, but unfortunately there were no dates nor any other details. We do have an aerial view there of the crash site, so from what Neil had already been told by his fellow ringers, he knew the site of the crash. In this aerial view of the site, you have Charlie Road, top right, running towards Ashby Road and the windmill. In the bottom left, you can see the eastern tip of Blackbrook Reservoir. Running between the two is One Barrow Lane. The aircraft came down in the narrow intersection of the ploughed field, where it comes down to meet One Barrow Lane. And you can see the arrow there that shows that, the impact area. And then if we take a look at ground level, this is the view from One Barrow Lane looking into the field across the impact area. On the surface, not surprisingly, just like any other field. But what lies beneath? Towards the end of 1999, using just a basic metal detector, Neil began searching and found several items. Typical finds: machine gun rounds with head stamps of DM43 and LC43, and more of those markings in a minute. He also found pieces of painted and unpainted wreckage and stainless steel components, often badly twisted, but many had clear part numbers and other markings, such as you can see there, the R in a circle, and again, more of that in a minute. And also cylinder head fragments with cooling fins. And yet another one there, a cockpit instrument gauge plate with calibration marks. Now, Neil was fairly new to all of this. He'd never done anything like this before, but in time he discovered how to interpret these letters and the numbers to reveal additional information about the crashed aircraft. So looking at the ammunition head stamps, DM is the Des Moines Ordnance Plant in Iowa. 43 is the year they were manufactured. I mentioned this a few slides ago. And LC is the Lake City Army Ammunition Plant. The factories also produced the black tip armor-piercing rounds, the blue tip incendiary rounds, and both of these were recovered from the crash site. And ammunition used in the Browning 50 caliber heavy machine guns was favoured by US fighters and bombers of World War II. And as already said, 43 is the year that they were manufactured for the ones found at the site. So if we move on to the symbols and the stamps, this component that you can see now is actually part of a cockpit ventilation system on the aircraft. The stretched R in the circle is the factory inspection stamp for the Republic Aircraft Corporation's Farmingdale plant in Long Island, New York. Republic were manufacturers of the P-47 Thunderbolts. If that R had been an RE, it would have indicated the aircraft production at Republic's Evansville plant in Indiana, but this stamp confirms that the Shepshed aircraft was made in New York. And it's worth looking at how a typical part number breaks down, and here's an example of this. So the 89 prefix defines the P-47 Thunderbolt, or model of 47B, 47C or 47D, i.e. an early P-47. And we know that that would have had a razorback fuselage. The later models of the Thunderbolt didn't have the razorback, and I believe Neil's told me that was to do with vision outside of the cockpit. The P identifies the part as being located in the power plant of the aircraft. If it was an F, it could be fuselage, C would be center panel, and S would be standard. 67 is the group in this case, the exhaust system installation, and 105 is the part identifying that assembly. In this case then, a P-47, B, C or D, so this is an early model P-47 with a razorback fuselage, as I've already said. So in that assembly, if we put all the numbers together, it tells us that these twisted pieces of stainless steel recovered from the site are a half-clamp assembly on the exhaust manifold of an early P-47 Thunderbolt. Anyway, for now, back to the investigation and the identification of two eyewitnesses that could bear testament to the crash. Just a slight warning, the next slide is a little bit frank. So the bell ringers suggested that that Neil should contact a couple of eyewitnesses to the crash, which Neil did. One of these was William Stanley, who wrote back in June 2000, giving a rather graphic account. As a local farmer, he was in the yard at the time and saw the aircraft power dive into the field. He attended immediately, taking a fire extinguisher with him, and he recounted the pilot's body was in the next field on fire. I was able to extinguish the flames on his body. We know that GIs were sent to guard the site, but unfortunately Bill couldn't provide any date, information, nor any details about the pilot or the aircraft. So, what did Neil know for sure after 2 years? Well, he knew the crash centred in a field just off the right of 1 Barrow Lane in Shepshed on the way to Blackbrook Reservoir. Wreckage confirmed that the aircraft was an early model P-47 Thunderbolt. It was manufactured by the Republic Aircraft Corporation at their Farmingdale plant in Long Island, New York, not Evansville. The crash could not have occurred before 1943, bearing in mind the stamps on the ammunition, and we know that the pilot was killed in the accident. But crucially, there was no date, no pilot ID, and no aircraft serial number. And without at least one of these, locating any formal records was going to be fairly difficult. So Neil went looking for help, and he made contact with John Collier, who is here tonight, an accomplished aviation historian specialising in Leicestershire air crashes. But despite pooling their efforts, having exhausted all lines of inquiry, the investigation came to a standstill. The Bird's Eye Wartime Leicestershire publication did offer some information. It talked about a crash on the 28th of October 1944, and it crashed near Shepshed with 1 fatality. Now note that date. Following extensive searches here and in the US, neither John or Neil could find any records that matched this crash. So there was no progress really for 7 years. But then, do you remember earlier there had been 2 eyewitnesses approached, but only 1 had replied? Well, finally, we have the other eyewitness. And Neil had originally contacted Mr. Hull for information in 2000 at the same time as Bill Stanley, but had no response. But a second request later proved very informative. Mr. Hull's reply said, a letter from the RAF indicates that the Thunderbolt crashed on the 24th of October, not the 28th as previously said. And the registration number, which was a vital part, was 42801. And he thought it came from Atcham in Shropshire. The guy in that photograph is actually Harry Hull's father, Meredith, pictured at the top of 1 Barrow Lane with the crash site visible in the top right-hand side. So, plain sailing from here. Or perhaps not exactly. Because one of our documents is missing, and it's a crucial one. Now, Harry Hull's information was used to request a United States Air Force aircraft accident report that would normally identify the pilot and provide details of the crash, including any possible causes. But this was either never filed, never copied, or lost. And to date, that document has never been located. Alternative sources of information would reveal more about the aircraft, but identifying the pilot just got a whole lot more difficult. So let's for a moment look at the information of the aircraft which we could find. So using various sources, details of the aircraft emerged, charting its history and to some extent its fate. The National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. were able to provide an individual aircraft record card, an IARC, for the plane. This is essentially the aircraft's birth and death certificate. Other survivable accidents involving this aircraft were documented in accident reports that were easily obtained. Thank you. Combat history for 428.001 is freely available in web-based searches, and United States Army, Air Force and RAF documents that make brief reference to that and a fatal crash in Shepshed. If we also look at the details of the government order which Neil managed to find. So the order was received by the Republic Aircraft Corporation in March 43. Cost was $76,000, which is about $1.2 million today. And it was shipped from New York to Great Britain between the 15th and 30th of June 1943, which links in with the date stamps on those shells. The actual aircraft model designation was a P-47D-2RE. It was the 44th out of 445 of that model constructed at the Farmingdale plant in Long Island, New York. And it's important to note the details for 48001 in the order that they are consistent with the Farmingdale inspection stamps that was found on the wreckage. And the part numbers on the wreckage are consistent with this model of P-47. In other words, this order for 428.001 is entirely consistent with the aircraft that crashed in Shepshed, having looked at the Farmingdale inspection stamps and part numbers, etc. on it, which we talked about earlier. And so finally, there she is. This photograph of the Shepshed Thunderbolt was taken in the summer of 1943. The aircraft had been assigned to the 353rd Fighter Group, 350th Fighter Squadron, based at Metfield in Suffolk. The thing that looks like a bomb slung under the aircraft is actually a 108-gallon centerline drop tank for additional fuel. The P-47s were powered with an 18-cylinder, 46-litre Pratt & Whitney Radiator engine that was quite thirsty, and this just extended the range of the aircraft. So the aircraft starts its combat life, assigned to this chap, Major Ben Rimmerman. He was a squadron leader in the 350th Fighter Squadron and provided escort cover for bombers attacking targets in Western Europe, St Andre, Bremen, Brunswick, Wilhelmshaven, and performed counter-air sweeps over France and the Low Countries. It was involved in dive bombing and strafing other targets in France, and it was documented in the 353rd Fighter Group raids between October 43 and February 44. But as you will see from the next slide, accidents will happen. And the first one documented for our aircraft was on the 24th of October 43, when Lieutenant Charles Dins borrows it to meet a former squadron member at Gox Hill. Landing back at Metfield that night, too slow lowering the undercarriage, wheels up landing, damaged the prop engine, cowling and belly, not to mention his reputation at breaking his squadron leader's relatively new aircraft. Anyhow, it was repaired and returned to combat service. It's a chilling coincidence that 12 months on from this date, this same aircraft here would lay destroyed in a Shepshed field. We then move on to a very close call for the aircraft on the 3rd of February 44. It's being flown by the guy at the top, Captain Dewey Newhart, providing escort cover for 360 B-17 Flying Fortresses. And 60 miles from target, another P-47 flown by Captain Wilford Hurst collided with 428.001 during a dogfight, hitting the first and second gun, engine cowl, and propeller, slicing off Hurst's tail. Hurst, spiraled out of control, unable to bail out of his 47, was killed. He was only 21 years old. Hurst spiraled out of control, unable to bail out, and was killed. So Newhart battled to return the badly damaged aircraft to Metfield with no instruments and a heavy vibrating engine. The fact he made it at all is testament to how rugged the 47s actually were. And it's sad to note that just 4 months later, Newhart's luck would also run out, and he would be killed at the controls of another P-47 while strafing an enemy truck convoy in France. So it seems that the Wilhelmshaven raid probably marked the beginning of the end for the aircraft. At some stage following that mid-air collision, it was classified as WW, war weary. Considered no longer for combat operations, the aircraft was to be used for training purposes only. The hand-me-down fighter was transferred to Atcham in Shropshire and assigned to the 495th Fighter Training Group, 551st Fighter Training Squadron. Replacement pilots from the US would get their first UK flying experiences in this and similar aircraft, preparing for the European theatre operations. But there was time for just one more mishap involving the aircraft, and this was in July 44, about 12 weeks before the fatal crash in Shepshed. And Lieutenant Richard Stark, on a low-level navigation route, failed to see the tree in the path of the aircraft. Amazing. Hitting the starboard wing on the treetop, he took evasive action, landed safely back at Atcham, and once again it was back in the body shop. And so to the fatal crash. Various aircraft-related documents revealed that on the 24th of October, the aircraft impacts hard in the field off One Barrow Lane. The pilot is killed instantly from major trauma. There's an operational record book entry in the 108 Operational Training Unit based at Wimeswold that says 24th of October, a Thunderbolt from Atcham crashed near Shepshed, the pilot being killed. Later, an identity disc was found, which led to the identity of the pilot as belonging to a United States Army Air Force unit. Entry in a cumulative loss list writing off a war-weary plane on the 25th of October 1944 is recorded. The unit involved in the recovery was the 4th Mobile Reclamation and Repair Squadron based at Neaton in Norfolk, and the American soldiers GI seen by several local eyewitnesses of the scene following the accident. The individual aircraft record card shows it as condemned and salvaged around the 25th of December 1944. So, after 9 years, Neil and John had the what, the where, and the when, but they still didn't know the who and the why. And it would be another 10 years before the next breakthrough happened. So if we fast forward to 2017, and this would come from John Collier, Neil's friend and fellow researcher. And John uncovered a 495th Fighter Training Group document recording events for October 1944. And it listed 6 pilot fatalities in non-battle air crashes throughout the month. One crash recorded on the 24th of October, complete with name and service number. So here we have in Flight Officer Charles E. Burdick. So Neil set to work with internet searches, emails, letters, phone calls to the US. But one line of inquiry was to take the investigation into a completely unexpected direction involving a transatlantic excursion. So working with genealogists in Brooklyn, Neil traced the pilot's grave to a cemetery in Albany, New York, and the grave had a plot owner. Online detective work and speculative letter writing, Neil managed to make the contact with Arthene LaValle, the pilot's first cousin. Arthene had got many personal effects belonging to Charles and had been very close to his mother, her aunt, until her death in 1989. Neil asked if he could visit her to learn more about the pilot, document this material and visit the grave. Arthene said yes, but she was a bit puzzled and wondered if Charles was his father. But Neil assured her that he wasn't, and the Royal Navy had taken care of that, which actually sounds even worse, doesn't it? That's what Neil said anyway. Okay. So on the 9th of July 2019, Neil boarded an AA Flight 729 from Heathrow to Philadelphia, then on to Albany in New York State, where he was met at the airport by Arthene, and just 40 minutes later, he was stood at the pilot's grave. Neil's put a family tree up there. He just did that. I know you can't; it's too small to read. But he did that just to check the link between Arthene and the pilot, because obviously there's quite an age difference there. But he did research that to check that it did all fit in with his information. Anyway, Arthene was as good as a word, and I suppose you could call it information overload. There was 137 letters mailed home to his parents. Pilot training, dog tags, graduation pilot's wings, war medals, photos, etc. In fact, there was so much material that she suggested that he should bring all the information back for copying, which he did. There's also an individual deceased personnel file there from an archive in St. Louis, Missouri. So it provides an incredibly intimate picture of our pilot, his family, and the path that would ultimately lead to his fate in Shepshed. And I think Neil's brought some of those, copied of those letters, etc., on the display for you to look at later. And here he is, Charles Edward Burdick, or Eddie, as he was known. And he was born 30th of June 1920 in Schenectady, I think that's how you pronounce it. Only child of Frank and Rita Burdick. Grew up in Rotterdam town, Schenectady County. Age 21, he was a semi-skilled crane operator at the GEC. But all that was about to change. Because on the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the US enters World War II. And on Sunday, the 2nd of Feb, Eddie makes his way to 323 Federal Building, Albany, enlists in the United States Army Air Corps. A few days later, arrives for basic Army training and processing at Fort Dix, Trenton, New Jersey. 3 weeks after enlisting, transfers to his first pilot training airbase. Indeed, it is the Albany building where Eddie makes that life-changing decision when he enlists in the US Army and his journey to Shepshed begins. And Shepshed begins to direct his life. Now, I mentioned earlier there were 137 letters that he sent home. And we see Eddie's first letter here. And it's dated February 42. And he says, as soon as I get back, I'm going to get married and raise 14 kids. So I won't have to go to another war. From now on, I'm going to study hard, but no need to worry about anything. And above all, think I'm on vacation. Write often. So he's saying, going to study and and he's trying to reassure his parents, no need to worry. And he gives his new Texas home, signs off with, your cowboy soldier son, love, Eddie. Now, Neil has read all of the letters, and he gets a huge sense from that of what Eddie was like. A loving son with concern for his family and not wanting them to worry about where he was. And I've talked to Neil about that, and that's an overriding sort of theme of the letters that he sent. So if we move on to Eddie's biggest fear, the next 18 months would see Eddie training at various air bases in Colorado, Georgia, and California before returning to Texas in the summer of 43 to do his primary pilot training at Garner Field. And there's a picture here on the flight line with his instructor and fellow trainee pilots in front of a Fairchild PT-19B training aircraft. Now, his biggest fear was washing out, i.e. not completing the training. And he says, we've had fellows washing out because they get air sickness. They've been up several times and toshed a chowder each time. And Ian said, but I've been lucky, I managed to cork up both ends. So, a week later, and Eddie proudly writes, I soloed last Saturday, and I sure do feel good about it. But Neil knows from his research that this was not the whole story, because what really happened on the 14th of October 43 was, yes, Eddie made a satisfactory first follow landing. The second landing, very heavy, cracked the center section, bent the left landing gear, basically a crash. Air accident reports decided it was 100% pilot error, total lack of general experience. But Eddie, not wanting to worry his mum and dad, didn't come clean about it for almost a fortnight when he writes, well, I have a little confession. And then he said, well, I have a little confession to make on my second solo. I mushed a plane. It was a rough landing, and I received a jar. So again, mention the letters and the concern already mentioned. He didn't want to worry his parents by mentioning the slight accident that he had. And so Eddie gets his wings. He didn't mush any more planes, and he got his wings. In March 44, Eddie graduates at Moorfield Mission, Texas. His mother, Retha, makes a 2,200-mile Pullman train journey from New York to see her son receive his wings. And he arranged a 10-day stay for her at the Casa de Palmas Hotel in nearby McAllen, Texas. Again, concern for his family is showing through. How proud she must have been at that time, but how fearful for the times ahead. And just 32 weeks later, her worst fears would be realised in a chaplain's letter written from an airbase in England. But for now, Eddie prepares for war. And on the 6th of May, he writes, in 6th of May 44, he writes, by the looks of things, I guess I'm going to fly the P-47. And Eddie takes another step closer to Shepshed. And the emphasis now was on flying combat aircraft and becoming an effective fighter pilot. So between May and September, Eddie trains at various pilot replacement units in Richmond, Washington, D.C., Camp Springs, and finally at Millville Army Airfield, New Jersey, where Eddie appears in a list of replacement training unit P-47 pilots. Eddie's last known letter was on the 5th of September 1944. The letter contains a poem, the last lines reading, she was just one big thrill, the best of the land, that P-47 Thunderbolt of the fighter command. Eddie signs off that letter in very much the same way that he has signed off the other 136 with, well, I guess that is the close of the letters, so good night to you both. Regards to everyone, your loving son, Eddie. Now, Neil doesn't have a date for when Eddie crossed the Atlantic, but it must have been late September or early October when he joins the 495th Fighter Training Group, 551st Fighter Training Squadron at Atcham in Shropshire. Atcham is a combat replacement Atcham is a combat crew replacement centre. Okay, and pilots were assigned, instructing pilots, in the European theatre of war tactics. Pilots were then assigned to the 8th or the 9th Air Force for combat duties, but as we know, Eddie never made it. Because putting all those findings together, we now know that on the morning of the 24th of October 1944, Eddie climbs into the P-47 and takes off from Atcham on a training flight. His flying time to Shepshed could have been as little as 15 minutes, given the cruising speed of a P-47. And although we don't know exactly what happened in the skies over Shepshed that morning, what we do know is that at 9:05, he was killed instantly when the aircraft slams into the field off One Barrow Lane. The 4 Mobile Reclamation Repair Squadron attend and recover his body and remove larger sections of aircraft wreckage. And in Eddie's pockets, they find 9 English pounds that were burnt and various photographs. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 28th of October 44, he was interred at Cambridge American Military Cemetery in Madingley, which is near Cambridge. The temporary grave was marked by a wooden cross bearing his dog tag, recovered from the Shepshed field. And included on this slide is his mother Rita's heartbreaking request for the return of her son's body. In a letter written to the effects quartermaster, she signs off her letter with, "My son was my only child, and my cross is hard to bear." And so to Eddie's final journey. His parents wrote another letter on the 21st of November 1944 to the Quartermaster General in Washington, D.C., asking to bring his remains back to the States before the end of the war. But sadly, that was never going to happen. The US would not repatriate any of their war dead until hostilities had ceased. Eddie's parents were in for a very long wait, because it wasn't until the 17th of April 1948 that Eddie's body is disinterred at Madingley, transported by truck and rail to Cardiff docks, where he is put on board the US Army transport ship, the Lawrence Victory, to begin the Atlantic crossing on the 18th of June. The photograph there shows the Lawrence Victory about to set sail with Eddie's body on board, together with a staggering 4,382 other fallen comrades. And so Eddie is finally laid to rest on the 10th of July 1948 at Memory Gardens Cemetery, Albany, New York. And this is where Neil had stood after arriving there, 40 minutes after arriving by plane earlier on. So why did Eddie crash? Unfortunately, without all the important accident reports, this part of the story will remain a mystery. However, there are several factors worth considering. The aircraft was war-weary, we knew that. Did the aircraft let Eddie down? Training in the clear blue skies of Texas was a far cry from foggy Leicestershire. October 44 was a particularly bad month for fog, and Atcham did document this. The terrain, poor visibility, and formation flying was often a lethal mix. In the hurry to supply replacement combat pilots, the quality of pilot training came into serious question. Atcham's record apparently was so bad at this time it prompted a formal inquiry by Major Irvin Miller, who immediately introduced some back-to-basics training for the young pilots. Questions raised in Congress about Atcham's fatal accident rate significantly higher than any other base. And the United States Army Air Force logged 54,000 training accidents with 15,000 fatalities. And sadly, Eddie was just one of that 15,000. And so to today, just over 76 years later, Eddie really was a pilot lost and found. He was certainly lost to the people of Shepshed for 79 years. And so we don't lose him again. This lady, top right, who's here tonight, Amanda Halliday, daughter of the 11-year-old schoolboy who saw Eddie crash in 1944, organised a campaign to raise funds for a stone memorial to be placed off One Barrow Lane, next to where Eddie's aircraft came down on the picture we showed earlier. The memorial stone base is inscribed with the last two lines of Eddie's poems, if you remember from the letters that he wrote. She was just one big thrill, the best of the land. That P-47 Thunderbolt of the fighter command. The stone was unveiled on the 27th of October 2019, just 3 days after the 75th anniversary of Eddie's crash. And the unveiling service was conducted by Reverend John Bird from this church. And so after more than 20 years, we find ourselves back where we started, because it was St. Botolph's church that in a way wrote the first page of this story. And it seems rather fitting that the same church is here to close its final chapter. And there's a few pictures of Eddie, the Thunderbolt, and the crash site. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that as interesting as I did. I think what we'll do now, if you want to, go and get yourself a drink, and then what we'll do is we'll take some questions. Is that okay, Neil, or did you want to take some now, or how do you feel about that? Do you want to take some now then, or? Okay, right. Shall we get a microphone and... Okay. Right. Anybody want to start? Or do you want to start, Neil? Any bits I've missed?
No.
No? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. There you go.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. So, is it likely then that this was a typical low-flying accident, perhaps due to poor visibility, and he came in, hadn't surveyed the route properly before setting out and flew straight into the ground?
I suppose we'll never really know. Accidents, and it could have been anything. It could the plane had been knocked about like mad. It could have let him down. I think he did have a mid-air collision, but I've not been able to find anything to back that up. I think he had a mid-air collision, and possibly the other aircraft landed safely at another airfield. And I'm looking at Amanda here because I think your father actually thought the same, and he'd said as much, but I can't find any evidence of that. I've looked at local airfields, looked at that date, and I can't find any sort of documentation to back that up. But there were an awful lot of mid-air collisions. There were 2 crashed over Desford, 2 Thunderbolts, and so they were colliding a lot. And I think it is significant that on the map there, Charles, or Eddie, did most of his training in Texas, and it must have been one heck of a shock coming here in autumn, winter. Visibility is just terrible.
You've all gone shy. Okay, well, shall we break for a drink? There's the exhibition over at the side which Neil's brought in. Neil's around. If I can identify, John Collier is here as well. And Amanda Halliday, thank you. So do please ask these people about it. They know much more than I do about it. I find it fascinating. But, do please just have a look, have a chat, and ask any questions that you like. So if you'd like to make your way over into that corner, you in the corner have got a benefit now. You're nearer the coffee, so you can start, okay? And then we'll regroup, okay? But do please stay. Don't rush off, because there's still more to see.